The morning fog hung heavy over San Francisco Bay on December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, when Dorothy Mitchell stood outside the Pacific shipyard gates for the first time. She was 23 years old, her hands soft from years of typing correspondence at her father's law office, her auburn hair pinned carefully beneath a borrowed kerchief. The gates towered before her like the entrance to another world, one she had never imagined entering. Through the chain-link fence, she could see hundreds of workers streaming toward the massive steel structures that rose against the grey sky like sleeping giants waiting to be awakened. Dorothy clutched the folded newspaper in her coat pocket, the one with the headline she had read a dozen times, "America at War." Inside that pocket, nestled against the newsprint, was a telegram that had arrived 3 weeks earlier. It was brief, impersonal, the kind of message that changed everything in an instant. Her brother James had enlisted in the Marines the day after the attack. Her fiancé Robert had followed 2 days later. Both were gone now, somewhere in training camps she couldn't picture, preparing for battles she didn't want to imagine. The woman standing beside her at the gate was older, maybe 40, with calloused hands and a determined set to her jaw. "First day?" she asked, and Dorothy nodded. "Mine too," the woman said. "Name's Margaret O'Brien. My husband's in the Navy. My oldest boy's heading to England next month with the Army Air Corps." She looked at the shipyard with something between fear and resolve. "Figure if they're going to fight, least I can do is build them something to fight with." Dorothy thought about those words as the morning whistle blew and the gates swung open. She had never held a wrench in her life, had never seen the inside of a factory, but Margaret was right. If James and Robert were willing to die, she could at least be willing to learn. Before we continue with Dorothy's story, I want to ask you something. If this story is touching your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support means everything, and knowing where our viewers are helps us understand how these stories of courage and sacrifice resonate across the world. Thank you. And now let's continue. The foreman who met them inside was a thick-shouldered man named Pete Sullivan, his face weathered by decades of shipyard work. He looked at the group of 30 women assembled before him with unconcealed skepticism. "Most of you have never done a day of real labor in your lives," he said, his voice cutting through the industrial din. "Half of you probably think a rivet gun is something you use to fix a fence post." A few nervous laughs rippled through the group. "But we're at war now, and this country needs ships. Liberty ships, destroyers, carriers. The Navy's placing orders faster than we can fill them, and every man who knows his way around a welding torch is either enlisting or getting drafted." He paused, letting his gaze move from face to face. "So here's how it's going to work. You're going to learn, and you're going to learn fast. Because every ship that leaves this yard could be the one that brings somebody's son home alive. Every rivet you place, every weld you make, every bolt you tighten, that's a life you might be saving. Don't forget that. Not for a single second." Dorothy felt the weight of those words settle in her chest. She thought of James, who used to climb trees in their backyard and come home with scraped knees and a grin that nothing could diminish. She thought of Robert, who had proposed to her on a beach in Monterey just 3 months ago, slipping a modest ring on her finger and promising her a lifetime of Sunday mornings and quiet happiness. The war had taken both of them from her, at least temporarily, and now she stood in this massive, echoing space, surrounded by machinery she didn't understand, accepting her role in a conflict that stretched far beyond anything she had ever known. The training was brutal. For the first week, Dorothy's hands bled from gripping tools she barely knew how to use. Her shoulders ached from hours of holding heavy equipment in awkward positions. The noise of the shipyard, the hammering, the grinding, the shouting, followed her home at night, echoing in her dreams. She shared a small apartment with 3 other women from the yard: Margaret O'Brien, a quiet young woman named Ruth Kowalski, whose husband was somewhere in North Africa, and Helen Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American whose entire family had volunteered for war work after her two brothers enlisted in the army. They became a family of sorts, these four women bound together by exhaustion and purpose. Every evening they would return to their apartment, too tired to speak, and take turns soaking their battered hands in warm water. Margaret would make coffee, real coffee when they could get it, a chicory substitute when they couldn't, and they would sit together, reading letters when they came, sharing news from the radio, holding each other up through the weight of worry that never fully lifted. By the end of the first month, Dorothy could identify every tool in the shipyard, could read blueprints with a competence that surprised her instructors, could work a rivet gun with a speed that earned her a grudging nod of approval from Pete Sullivan. She had become someone she didn't recognize, someone with calloused hands and grease under her fingernails, someone who could climb a scaffold 50 feet in the air without her heart racing, someone who understood that a properly placed rivet could mean the difference between a ship that came home and one that didn't. Winter gave way to spring, and the pace of work intensified. The shipyard operated around the clock now. 3 shifts that kept the welding torches burning and the hammers ringing at all hours. Dorothy moved to the night shift, working from midnight to 8 in the morning, her body clock completely inverted. She would arrive home as the sun was rising, exhausted beyond words, and fall into bed while the rest of the city was waking up. But there was a strange beauty to the night shift, she discovered. The work continued in pools of artificial light, creating a separate world where time seemed suspended, where the only thing that mattered was the ship taking shape beneath their hands. It was during one of those long night shifts in April of 1942 that Dorothy met Catherine Kate Morrison. Kate had been transferred from another yard in Seattle, a woman in her early 30s with a shock of blonde hair that she kept tied back in a practical braid. She had been working in shipyards since before the war started, one of the few women who had fought her way into the industry when it was still almost entirely male. She knew welding like other people knew breathing, and within days of her arrival, she had been promoted to lead a team of 20 workers, including Dorothy. "You're good," Kate told Dorothy one night as they worked together on the hull of a destroyer, the metal glowing orange beneath their torches. "Better than most of the men we had here before the war, if I'm being honest. You've got steady hands and you pay attention. That matters more than strength in this work." Dorothy felt a flush of pride that was immediately tempered by guilt. "My brother's in the Pacific somewhere," she said. "I got a letter last week, but it was so censored I could barely read it. Just know he's alive, at least as of whenever he wrote it." Kate nodded, her face illuminated by the blue flame of her torch. "My husband's in the army somewhere in England, planning something big from what I can gather between the lines. And my sister's a nurse, Army Nurse Corps, probably on a ship or in a field hospital by now." She adjusted her protective goggles and returned to her work. "We're all doing what we can, right? That's all any of us can do." But Kate's words, simple as they were, stayed with Dorothy. All any of us can do. It became a kind of mantra, something she repeated to herself during the long hours when her arms shook with fatigue and her eyes burned from staring at bright metal in the darkness. It was what she thought about when letters arrived from James, his words carefully chosen to avoid revealing his location, but unable to hide his fear. It was what she thought about when she received shorter, more controlled letters from Robert, whose unit was training for something he couldn't name, but that filled every line with tension. The war transformed not just the shipyard, but the entire city. San Francisco became a place of constant motion, of troops shipping out and supplies shipping in, of neighborhoods that emptied as men left and filled again with workers arriving from all over the country. The streets were crowded at all hours. Restaurants and shops struggled to keep up with rationing, and everywhere you looked, there were reminders of the conflict that had swallowed the world. Posters urged citizens to buy war bonds, to save scrap metal, to plant victory gardens. The newspapers were filled with reports from distant battlefields, from places most Americans had never heard of before, December 1941. Dorothy and her roommates adapted to this new reality with the same determination they brought to their work. They stood in line for their ration books, carefully managing their allotments of sugar, coffee, butter, and meat. Helen, who had learned to cook from her mother, became expert at creating meals that stretched their rations, finding ways to make a small portion of meat feed 4 people, supplementing with vegetables from the victory garden they planted in the small plot behind their building. Margaret, who had never worked outside her home before the war, learned to repair their clothes, to darn socks and patch pants and let out seams, making everything last as long as possible. Ruth, the quietest of the 4, spent her evenings writing letters. She wrote to her husband Tom, who was with Patton's forces in North Africa, but she also wrote to other soldiers, men she had never met, names she got from a list at the USO. "No mail, low morale," she would say, echoing the common wisdom. "If I can make one soldier feel less alone, it's worth it." She wrote dozens of letters every week, filling them with news from home, with descriptions of their work at the shipyard, with small jokes and observations that she hoped would bring a moment of lightness to men living in conditions she couldn't begin to imagine. Summer arrived, bringing with it heat that turned the shipyard into an inferno of hot metal and burning air. The work became even more grueling, the temperature inside the ships sometimes reaching unbearable levels. Women fainted regularly, overcome by heat and exhaustion, but the pace never slowed. The Navy needed ships, needed them desperately, and everyone in the yard understood that every hour mattered. Dorothy learned to work through the heat, to ignore the sweat that poured down her face and soaked through her clothes, to push past the dizzy spells that sometimes threatened to overwhelm her. She learned to drink water constantly, to take salt tablets, to recognize the signs of heat exhaustion in her co-workers and get them to safety before they collapsed. It was in July, during a brief break on a particularly scorching afternoon, that Pete Sullivan gathered Dorothy's section together. His face was grave, and Dorothy felt her stomach tighten with dread before he even spoke. "We've got news from the Pacific," he said. "The Marines landed on an island called Guadalcanal. They're meeting heavy resistance. It's going to be a long fight." Dorothy's hands were shaking as she returned to work. Guadalcanal. She didn't know where it was, couldn't picture it, but she knew James was in the Pacific, knew the Marines were his core. That night, unable to sleep, she went to the public library and found an atlas, traced her finger across the vast blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean until she found the tiny speck labeled Guadalcanal. It was so small, barely visible on the map, and yet it was consuming the lives of thousands of men, James perhaps among them. The waiting was its own kind of torture. Days became weeks with no word, and Dorothy threw herself into her work with an intensity that worried even Kate. She volunteered for every extra shift, worked until her supervisors ordered her to go home, pushed herself past the point of exhaustion because the alternative, sitting still, thinking, worrying, was unbearable. Margaret understood. Her son had shipped out to England in June, was somewhere in the build-up of forces that everyone knew would eventually have to cross the Channel into occupied Europe. Helen's brothers were with the army in the Pacific, location unknown. Ruth's husband was fighting in the desert of North Africa. They were all living with the same anxiety, the same helpless fear that came with loving someone who was in harm's way. Then, in early September, a letter arrived. Dorothy recognized James's handwriting on the envelope, and her hands trembled so badly that Margaret had to help her open it. The letter was dated 3 weeks earlier, and it was longer than his previous messages, less censored. He wrote about heat and rain, about living in muddy foxholes and fighting for every yard of ground. He wrote about friends he had lost, about exhaustion that went beyond anything he had ever experienced. But he also wrote about the men beside him, about Marines who kept fighting even when they were wounded, who shared their last cigarettes and looked out for each other. And he wrote about home, about thinking of Dorothy and their parents, about the life he planned to build when the war was over. At the end of the letter, he had written something that Dorothy would remember for the rest of her life. "I know you're working at the shipyard now, Dot. Mom told me in her last letter. I want you to know that matters. When we see supply ships coming in, when we get equipment and ammunition, we know that's because of people like you back home. You're fighting this war just as much as we are, just in a different way. Don't ever forget that." Dorothy read those words over and over, and something shifted inside her. The work she was doing wasn't just a way to fill time while the men were gone, wasn't just a temporary necessity until the war ended. It was real, it was vital, and it was hers. She was part of something larger than herself, part of a massive national effort that stretched from the factories and shipyards of America to battlefields across the world. Every ship that left San Francisco Bay carried with it a piece of her labor, her skill, her determination. It was a thought that gave her strength during the long months that followed. As summer turned to fall, the shipyard reached new levels of production. More women were hired every week until they made up nearly half the workforce. The sight that would have been shocking a year earlier, women in coveralls, climbing scaffolds, operating cranes, welding steel plates, had become commonplace. Dorothy found herself training new workers, passing on the skills she had learned, watching women who had never done manual labor transform themselves into skilled shipbuilders. There was pride in that, a sense of shared accomplishment that bound them together across all their differences. But the war also brought losses that were impossible to ignore. In October, Margaret received a telegram informing her that her oldest son had been shot down over Germany. He had survived barely and was now a prisoner of war. Margaret's grief was quiet but absolute. She continued working because what else could she do? But something had broken inside her. Dorothy and the others did what they could, sitting with her through the long nights when sleep wouldn't come, reading and rereading the brief letters that eventually arrived from the Red Cross, confirming that her son was alive, injured but alive. Then, in November, Helen's family received word that one of her brothers had been killed in action in the Pacific. The telegram arrived at the shipyard itself, delivered to the office, because Helen's parents didn't speak English well enough to receive such news over the phone. Dorothy was there when Helen came out of the office, her face blank with shock, moving like someone in a dream. She took her home, stayed with her through the first terrible hours, helped her family begin to process a loss that could never really be processed. The funeral was held at a Chinese Baptist church in Chinatown, and Dorothy attended with Margaret and Ruth. They stood in the back, not family, but not strangers either, united by work and war and the particular bond that forms between people who are enduring something too large to face alone. Helen's brother had been 21 years old, a boy who had grown up playing baseball on San Francisco streets and had died on an island whose name his parents couldn't pronounce. That night, lying in bed, Dorothy thought about all the families receiving similar telegrams, all the mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers learning that someone they loved was never coming home. She thought about the ships she was building, wondered if they would be enough, if all their work would be enough to bring this terrible war to an end. December brought the first anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose. President Roosevelt gave a radio address that Dorothy and millions of other Americans listened to, his words calling them to even greater efforts. The shipyard held a ceremony, recognizing the workers who had been there since the beginning, acknowledging the transformation that had taken place. Dorothy received a certificate of commendation for her work, a piece of paper she carefully folded and put in the same drawer where she kept James's letters and the engagement ring Robert had given her. Winter settled over San Francisco, bringing rain and cold that made the work even more difficult. The metal was freezing to the touch, and working conditions became treacherous. Women slipped on wet scaffolding, struggled with tools that wouldn't grip properly in the cold. But still the work continued, because it had to continue, because somewhere in the Pacific and in Europe and in North Africa, men were fighting and dying, and the least those at home could do was build the ships that would help them survive. It was in January of 1943 that Dorothy first heard about a new program the military was establishing. The Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASP, was recruiting women who already knew how to fly to ferry planes for the military, freeing up male pilots for combat duty. She mentioned it to Kate one night, and Kate's eyes lit up. "I learned to fly before the war," she said. "My husband taught me. I've been thinking about applying." 2 weeks later, Kate put in her notice at the shipyard. She was accepted into the WASP program and would be heading to Texas for training. The night before Kate left, the women threw her a small party at their apartment. They had saved their ration coupons to make a cake, and someone had found a bottle of champagne. "You're doing something incredible," Dorothy told her. "Flying planes for the military. Kate, that's extraordinary." Kate shook her head. "It's not more extraordinary than what you're doing, or what any of us are doing. We're all serving however we can. Some of us build ships, some of us fly planes, some of us nurse the wounded, some of us break codes or drive trucks or grow food. It all matters. That's what this war has taught me. All of it matters. Every single bit." Dorothy thought about that conversation often in the months that followed. Kate's departure created a hole in their work crew, but it was filled quickly by new arrivals. Always new arrivals, women streaming into the shipyard from all over the country. She worked alongside former teachers and secretaries, farm girls, and society women, a cross-section of America brought together by war and purpose. Some of them struggled and left, unable to adapt to the brutal physical demands and the constant danger. But most stayed because they had to, because their husbands or brothers or sons or lovers were overseas, because sitting idle while men died was unthinkable. The mail remained the lifeline that sustained them all. Letters from James arrived irregularly, sometimes 3 or 4 in a single week, sometimes nothing for a month. Each one was a gift, proof that he was still alive, still himself, despite everything he was enduring. He wrote about islands whose names became familiar from news reports: Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, each one purchased with American blood, each one bringing the war closer to Japan. Robert's letters were less frequent, more guarded, but Dorothy treasured them just as much. He was in Europe now, she knew that much, part of the massive build-up of forces in England. Spring of 1943 brought new challenges to the shipyard. There was a push to increase production even further, to meet the growing demands of a war that had expanded to encompass the entire world. The shipyard began building a new class of escort carriers, smaller than the fleet carriers, but crucial for protecting convoys and supporting amphibious operations. Dorothy was assigned to a team working on the hangar deck, a massive open space that would eventually house aircraft. The work was complex, requiring precision and coordination among dozens of workers. Pete Sullivan, who had become something like a father figure to many of the women in the yard, entrusted Dorothy with increased responsibilities, making her a team leader responsible for overseeing the work of 15 other people. The promotion came with pressure, but also with satisfaction. Dorothy had never imagined herself in a leadership role, had never thought of herself as someone others would follow. But the war had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. The young woman who had stood outside the shipyard gates in December of 1941, terrified and uncertain, barely existed anymore. In her place was someone stronger, more confident, someone who could read blueprints and manage teams and make decisions that affected the quality and safety of military vessels. But the cost of that transformation was visible everywhere. Dorothy saw it in the faces of the women she worked with, in the exhaustion that never fully lifted, in the moments when someone received bad news and the whole crew felt it. She saw it in Margaret, who had aged years in the months since learning her son was a prisoner of war, who worked with mechanical efficiency, but whose eyes held a sorrow that nothing could touch. She saw it in Ruth, who had received word in March that her husband had been severely wounded in Tunisia, who was waiting for news about whether he would recover, whether he would be sent home, whether he would ever be the same man who had left. And she felt it in herself, in the weariness that had settled into her bones, in the way her hands never fully stopped aching, in the dreams that sometimes woke her in the middle of the night. Dreams of James injured or dying, of Robert never coming home, of all the work they were doing being somehow insufficient to end the war and bring everyone home safely. Summer arrived again, bringing heat and news of Allied victories in North Africa and Sicily. The tide of the war seemed to be turning, though everyone knew that the hardest fighting still lay ahead. In the shipyard, they celebrated each milestone. Ships completed ahead of schedule, production records broken, commendations received from the Navy. But the celebrations were always tempered by awareness of why they were building these ships, of the battles they would enable, of the lives that depended on their work being done right. It was in August that Dorothy received the letter that changed everything. It came from Robert, and it was different from his usual careful messages. He wrote about D-Day, about the massive invasion of France that everyone had been anticipating for months. He wrote about seeing the beaches of Normandy, about the courage of the men who had gone ashore under withering fire, about the cost of every mile of ground retaken from the Germans. His unit had landed several weeks after the initial assault, part of the continuing build-up of forces in France. He was alive, unhurt, but the weight of what he had witnessed came through in every word. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "I don't know when this war will end, Dot. Sometimes it feels like it will go on forever. But I think about you constantly, about the life we planned, about the promises we made. I'm holding on to that. And I want you to know that what you're doing back home matters more than you probably realize. We see these ships, these planes, all this equipment, and we know it's because of people like you. You're giving us a chance to win this war and come home. Don't ever doubt that." Dorothy folded the letter carefully, added it to the growing stack in her drawer, and returned to work. The ship they were building would be finished in 3 weeks, would be commissioned and sent to the Pacific to support the island-hopping campaign that was slowly pushing toward Japan. She knew that James might serve on a ship like this, or be protected by it, or receive supplies delivered by it. Every weld had to be perfect, every rivet properly placed, every system tested and retested. Lives depended on it. Her brother's life, Robert's life, the lives of thousands of men whose names she would never know. Fall brought changes to the shipyard and to Dorothy's life. Helen, who had been working with quiet determination since her brother's death, announced that she was leaving to join the Army Nurse Corps. "I can't just build ships anymore," she said. "I need to do more. My parents don't understand, but I have to go." She left in October, heading to training that would eventually take her to field hospitals in Europe. Dorothy admired her courage, even as she mourned the loss of her friend and roommate. A new woman moved into Helen's room, a 19-year-old from Oklahoma named Betty, who had come west looking for war work after her fiancé was killed at Anzio. She was young and heartbroken and determined, throwing herself into the work with an intensity that reminded Dorothy of herself 2 years earlier. Dorothy took Betty under her wing, taught her the skills she needed, watched her transform from an uncertain girl into a capable worker. The winter of 1943-44 was the hardest yet. The war had been going on for 3 years now, and the strain was showing everywhere. Rationing had grown more severe, shortages were common, and the constant stress of worry had worn everyone down. In the shipyard, accidents became more frequent as exhausted workers made mistakes. Dorothy saw women collapse from fatigue, saw injuries that could have been prevented if people weren't being pushed beyond their limits. She spoke to Pete Sullivan about it, and he shook his head wearily. "I know," he said, "but the Navy's orders keep coming, and we can't slow down. We're in a race against time, trying to build ships faster than the enemy can sink them. All we can do is be as careful as possible and keep pushing forward." But the push took its toll. In January, a woman named Sarah Lewis fell from a scaffold and died of her injuries. She was 26 years old, had been working at the shipyard for 18 months, had a husband in the army and a daughter she was raising alone. Her death shook the entire yard. Dorothy attended the funeral, stood among hundreds of other workers who came to pay their respects, and felt the weight of Sarah's loss like a physical thing. This woman had given her life for the war effort, just as surely as any soldier who fell in battle, and yet there would be no medals, no official recognition, just a flag and a folded telegram, and a daughter who would grow up without her mother. The shipyard held a moment of silence in Sarah's honor, and work resumed. Because it had to resume, because the war didn't stop for grief, because somewhere in the world men were fighting and dying, and they needed the ships that were being built in places like this, all across America. Spring of 1944 brought news that electrified the nation. The Allies were planning something massive in Europe. Everyone could feel it. The newspapers spoke vaguely of preparations, of forces massing in England, of the second front that Stalin had been demanding for years. Dorothy thought about Robert constantly during those weeks, wondered if he would be part of whatever was coming, prayed that he would survive it. Then, on June 6th, it happened. D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. Dorothy was working the night shift when word spread through the shipyard, passed from person to person until everyone knew. The Allies had landed in France, were fighting their way off the beaches, beginning the liberation of Europe. Work stopped for a few minutes as people gathered around radios, listening to the reports, trying to comprehend the scale of what was happening. President Roosevelt led the nation in prayer, and in the shipyard, hardened workers wept openly, thinking of the men wading through the surf into German machine gun fire, thinking of the sons and husbands and brothers and fathers who were, in that moment, fighting for humanity's future. Dorothy returned to her work with shaking hands. Robert was there, she was certain of it. He was somewhere on those beaches or in the fields beyond them, was part of the greatest military operation in history. She worked through the rest of her shift in a daze, her mind in France while her body remained in California, her hands continuing their practiced motions while her thoughts were with the man she loved. The waiting for news was excruciating. Days passed with no word, then a week, then 2 weeks. Every morning, Dorothy checked the mail, hoping for a letter, dreading a telegram. Margaret watched her with sympathy, understanding the particular torture of not knowing. "He's alive," she said one evening, with more conviction than she probably felt. "You would know if he wasn't. You would feel it." Finally, in early July, a letter arrived. It was brief, written on paper that was stained and crumpled, but it was Robert's handwriting, and that was all that mattered. "I'm alive," he wrote. "I can't tell you much, but I'm alive and uninjured. We're pushing inland. It's hard, harder than anything I could have imagined, but we're making progress. The equipment is good, the support is constant. Thank the people building our ships and planes and everything else. Tell them it matters. I love you, Dot. I'll come home to you, I promise. Dorothy read that letter so many times she could recite it from memory. I'll come home to you, I promise. She clung to those words through the summer of 1944 as news from Europe told of bitter fighting, of progress measured in yards rather than miles, of casualties that were staggering even as the Allies pushed forward. In the Pacific, the news was similar. Victories purchased at terrible cost. James's letters continued to arrive, though they were increasingly dark in tone. He wrote about Peleliu and Iwo Jima, about volcanic islands that were turned into killing grounds, about Marines who kept advancing even as their friends fell around them. His words were those of someone who had seen too much, endured too much, and yet had to keep going because there was no alternative. The shipyard continued its relentless pace. By the fall of 1944, they had produced more than 100 ships, each one sent off with a brief ceremony, and then immediately forgotten as work began on the next. Dorothy had been promoted again, was now overseeing multiple teams, responsible for significant portions of each ship's construction. She had become one of the most skilled and trusted workers in the entire yard, someone Pete Sullivan relied on to handle the most difficult and important tasks. But success brought its own burdens. Dorothy felt the weight of responsibility constantly, knew that mistakes could cost lives. She double-checked everything, worked extra hours to ensure quality, pushed herself and her teams to maintain the highest standards. The exhaustion was bone-deep now, a constant companion that no amount of rest could fully alleviate. Winter came again, the fourth winter of the war, and with it a growing sense that perhaps finally the end might be in sight. In Europe, Allied forces were pushing toward Germany. In the Pacific, American forces were capturing islands closer and closer to Japan. The newspapers spoke cautiously of hope, of the possibility that 1945 might see the war's conclusion. Dorothy allowed herself to imagine it. James coming home, Robert returning, a wedding that had been postponed for years finally taking place, a return to some version of the normal life that had existed before December 1941. But she had changed too much for that old life to be fully possible. She couldn't imagine going back to typing correspondence in her father's law office, couldn't picture herself as the young woman she had been before the war, the work she had done, the skills she had learned, the confidence she had gained. All of that was part of who she was now, and she couldn't simply set it aside when the war ended. Margaret felt the same way. I was a housewife before all this, she said one evening. Took care of my home, raised my children, cooked my husband's meals. That was my whole world. But now I've built ships, overseen crews, done work I never imagined I could do. How do I go back to just being someone's wife and mother after this? It was a question Dorothy heard often from the women she worked with, a question none of them had good answers for. The new year, 1945, brought dramatic news. In Europe, the Germans launched a massive counter-offensive in the Ardennes, what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. For weeks, the outcome was uncertain, and Dorothy worried constantly about Robert. Then the Allies pushed back, and the German offensive collapsed. By February, Allied forces were crossing into Germany itself. In the Pacific, American forces landed on Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island that became the site of some of the bloodiest fighting of the war. Dorothy knew James's unit was involved even before his letter arrived, confirming it. She read the newspaper accounts with horror, learned about the Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi, about the weeks of savage fighting that followed. When James's letter finally came, it was the shortest he had ever sent. I'm alive. That's all I can say. I'm alive. But so many aren't. The shipyard workers followed the war's progress, with an intensity born of personal investment. These weren't abstract battles reported in newspapers. These were fights their brothers and husbands and sons were engaged in, and every victory or setback had direct meaning for them. When news came of President Roosevelt's death in April, the entire shipyard shut down for a day of mourning. Many of the workers wept openly. Roosevelt had led them through the Depression and then through this terrible war, and his death felt like a personal loss. But the war continued. In Europe, Allied forces raced through Germany, discovering the concentration camps and the full horror of Nazi atrocities. Dorothy read the accounts and felt sick, understanding that this was what they had been fighting against, that every ship she had built, every rivet she had placed had been in service of stopping something truly evil. Then, in early May, it ended. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The shipyard erupted in celebration, people hugging and crying and laughing all at once. Dorothy thought of Robert, wondered where he was, whether he had survived all the way to the end. She went home that day and sat with Margaret and Ruth and Betty, and they listened to the radio broadcast together, hearing about celebrations across the country, about the relief and joy that came with knowing the European war had finally ended. But their relief was tempered by the knowledge that the war in the Pacific continued. James was still out there, still fighting, and the invasion of Japan loomed on the horizon, a prospect that promised to be the bloodiest operation of the entire war. The shipyard immediately shifted focus, concentrating all their efforts on vessels that would be needed for the Pacific campaign. There was no time to rest, no break in the work. One war had ended, but the other continued. Letters from Robert began arriving more regularly now. He was in Germany, part of the occupation forces, would likely be redeployed to the Pacific for the invasion of Japan. "I survived Europe," he wrote. "Now I have to survive one more campaign. I'm so tired, Dot. So tired of war, of fighting, of death. But we have to finish this. We have to see it through." Dorothy understood that exhaustion. She felt it herself, felt it in everyone around her. They had been at war for nearly 4 years now, years of constant work and worry and loss. But Robert was right. They had to see it through, had to finish what had been started on that terrible December day in 1941. The summer of 1945 was a strange time, filled with contradictory emotions. There was joy that the European war had ended, but anxiety about the Pacific campaign that lay ahead. There was pride in what had been accomplished, but weariness that went beyond words. Dorothy continued working, continued building ships, but part of her felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Then, in early August, everything changed again. A new weapon, an atomic bomb, had been dropped on Japan. Then another. The destruction was beyond comprehension, entire cities obliterated in an instant. Dorothy listened to the news reports with a mixture of horror and hope. Horror at the weapon itself, at humanity's capacity for destruction. Hope that it might mean the war would end without the need for the invasion that would have cost countless American lives, James's among them. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Truly, finally over. The celebration that swept through San Francisco that day was unlike anything Dorothy had ever witnessed. Strangers embraced in the streets, cars honked their horns, people cried and laughed and sang. The shipyard shut down, and workers poured into the city, joining the massive crowds that filled every street and square. Dorothy found herself in the middle of it all, swept up in the joy and relief, tears streaming down her face as she thought about James and Robert, about all the people who would now come home, about all the families that would be reunited. She thought, too, about those who wouldn't come home, about Helen's brother and all the others like him, about Sarah Lewis who had died in the shipyard, about the hundreds of thousands of Americans who had given their lives to win this war. The celebration was joyful, but also bittersweet, marked by absence as much as by presence. In the weeks that followed, the reality of peace began to settle in. The shipyard started laying off workers, women first, as the men began returning from overseas. Dorothy knew it was coming, had expected it, but it still felt like a betrayal. "The war's over, so we're not needed anymore," Margaret said bitterly. "Back to our proper places, back to being just housewives and mothers." Dorothy felt the same resentment, but also a strange kind of relief. She had given 4 years to the war effort, had worked until her body ached and her hands bled, had transformed herself into someone she barely recognized. Maybe it was time to rest, to try to find some version of the life she had planned before everything changed. James came home in October, thinner and quieter than he had been, but alive and whole. Dorothy barely recognized the man who stepped off the train, this serious stranger wearing her brother's face, but when he hugged her, she felt him start to cry, and she held him while he shook with sobs, letting out years of fear and pain and trauma. "I'm home," he kept saying. "I'm finally home." Robert returned in November, and Dorothy was waiting on the dock when his ship came in. She saw him searching the crowd, saw the moment when his eyes found hers, and then he was pushing through the crowd toward her, and she was running to meet him, and they collided in an embrace that felt like coming back to life. He smelled of salt and sweat and exhaustion, and when he pulled back to look at her, she saw tears on his face. "I kept my promise," he said. "I came home to you." They were married in December, a simple ceremony with family and close friends. Margaret and Ruth and Betty were there, and Kate flew in from Texas where she was still working as a test pilot. Helen sent a telegram from Germany where she was helping care for concentration camp survivors. Pete Sullivan came, looking strange in civilian clothes, and shook Robert's hand and told him that Dorothy had been one of the best workers he had ever had the privilege to supervise. At the reception, held in the same church basement where they had attended countless war bond drives and Red Cross meetings, Dorothy looked around at the faces of the people who had become her family during these terrible years. She thought about everything they had endured together, about the work they had done, about the lives they had helped save. She thought about the woman she had been in December of 1941, standing outside the shipyard gates with soft hands and uncertainty in her heart, and the woman she was now, calloused and confident and fundamentally changed. Before we close, I want to ask you one more time. If this story has moved you, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment about where you're watching from. These stories of courage and sacrifice deserve to be remembered and shared. Thank you for being here. The months that followed were a period of adjustment for everyone. James struggled with nightmares and sudden silences, moments when the war came back to him in ways he couldn't control. Robert had similar struggles, times when ordinary sounds would make him flinch, when crowds made him anxious. Dorothy understood, in a way she couldn't quite articulate, that they were all carrying invisible wounds from these years, scars that wouldn't show, but would never fully heal. She tried to find work, but discovered that the jobs she was qualified for, the real jobs, the ones that used the skills she had developed, were no longer available to women. The returning men had priority, and employers made it clear that women were expected to return to traditional roles. She took a job as a secretary in a law office, and every day felt like a step backward, a diminishment of everything she had become. Margaret faced the same frustration. Her husband had returned, her son had been released from the prisoner of war camp, and she was supposed to be grateful and content. And she was grateful, deeply, profoundly grateful, that her family had survived. But she also mourned the loss of the work she had done, the purpose she had found, the person she had become in the shipyard. "Is it wrong," she asked Dorothy one day, "to miss the war?" Not the fear or the death or the suffering, but the work, the sense that what I was doing mattered. Dorothy understood completely. "I don't think it's wrong," she said. "I think it's honest. We gave everything we had to win that war, and now we're supposed to pretend it never happened, that we're the same people we were before, but we're not, and we can never be again." Ruth had perhaps the hardest adjustment of all. Her husband Tom had come home, but he was profoundly changed by his experiences in North Africa and Europe. He had nightmares, violent outbursts, periods of withdrawal that terrified Ruth. She tried to help him, tried to be patient and understanding, but the man who had come back was not the man who had left. Their marriage struggled through those first years of peace, and Ruth often looked back on her time in the shipyard with something like nostalgia, remembering when she had known her purpose and her place. Helen wrote letters from Germany, where she had chosen to stay with the Army Nurse Corps, helping displaced persons and concentration camp survivors. Her letters spoke of terrible things, the depth of Nazi cruelty, the scale of the suffering, but also of the satisfaction of helping people rebuild their lives. She had found her calling, she wrote, and planned to make nursing her career. Kate continued with the WASP program even after the war ended, eventually becoming a test pilot for a civilian aircraft company. She was one of the few women who managed to maintain a career in aviation, and she did it through sheer determination and skill. She wrote to Dorothy occasionally, letters that spoke of the challenges of being a woman in a man's field, but also of the joy of doing work she loved. Dorothy and Robert settled into married life, buying a small house in a new suburb south of San Francisco. She became pregnant in the spring of 1946, and their daughter was born in January of 1947. They named her Sarah, after the woman who had died in the shipyard, and Dorothy held her newborn daughter and thought about all the women who had sacrificed so that this new generation could grow up in a world at peace. But peace, Dorothy learned, was more complicated than she had imagined. The world had been permanently changed by the war. Nations realigned, new conflicts emerged, and the atomic age brought its own anxieties. And on a personal level, the war's effects lingered. James never fully recovered from his experiences in the Pacific, carrying his trauma through decades of life. Robert had nightmares for years, though they gradually became less frequent. Dorothy herself would sometimes wake in the night, her hands aching as if she had just put down her tools, her mind back in the shipyard with the sound of hammers and welding torches echoing in her memory. As the years passed, the war became history, something people studied in schools rather than lived through. The shipyards were dismantled or converted to other uses. Most of the women who had worked there returned to traditional roles, their contributions largely forgotten or minimized in the official accounts of the war. When people spoke of World War II, they talked about battles and generals, about soldiers and sailors and airmen. They rarely mentioned the women who had built the ships and planes and weapons, who had kept the home front functioning, who had served as nurses and volunteers, and in 100 other ways. But Dorothy remembered. She remembered every exhausting shift, every ship launched, every letter received and letter written. She remembered the women she had worked with, Margaret and Ruth and Helen and Kate and Betty and Sarah and countless others whose names she had forgotten but whose faces remained clear in her memory. She remembered the transformation she had undergone, from uncertain young woman to skilled shipbuilder to team leader, and she understood that those years had shaped her in ways that could never be undone. When her daughter Sarah grew old enough to ask about the war, Dorothy told her stories, not sanitized versions, not patriotic myths, but honest accounts of what it had been like to live through those years. She told her about the fear and the exhaustion, but also about the pride and the purpose. She told her about the women who had stepped into roles they had never imagined, who had proven themselves capable of anything, who had helped win a war through their labor, and their sacrifice. She wanted Sarah to understand that her mother had been more than just a housewife and secretary, that she had once been someone important, someone skilled, someone whose work had mattered. She wanted her daughter to know that women were capable of anything, even if the world tried to tell them otherwise. She wanted to pass on the lessons she had learned in the shipyard, about determination and resilience, about the power of working toward a common goal, about the strength that comes from enduring hardship together. Robert supported this, understanding in his own way what Dorothy was trying to preserve. He would add his own stories, about seeing the ships his wife had helped build, about the equipment and supplies that had kept him and his fellow soldiers alive, about the victory that had been won as much by the people at home as by the troops overseas. He wanted Sarah to understand that the war had been a total effort, requiring courage from everyone, whether they wore uniforms or overalls. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, Dorothy watched as women began pushing again for equal opportunities, for the right to work in jobs that used their full abilities. She watched the rise of a new feminist movement and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Part of her was proud, seeing the younger generation fighting for rights she had briefly enjoyed during the war. Part of her was bitter, remembering how quickly those opportunities had been taken away when the war ended. And part of her was simply tired, exhausted by decades of living in a world that seemed determined to forget what women had proven themselves capable of. Margaret became involved in veterans organizations, working to help returning soldiers and their families adjust to civilian life. She never forgot her son's time as a prisoner of war, and she devoted herself to making sure that other families received the support they needed. She and Dorothy remained close friends throughout their lives, bound by their shared experiences in the shipyard, by the understanding that they had been part of something extraordinary, even if the world had largely forgotten it. Ruth's marriage eventually ended in divorce, a scandal in their community, but a relief for Ruth, who had tried for years to make it work with a man who could never fully leave the war behind. She went back to school, became a teacher, and found satisfaction in shaping young minds. She occasionally spoke to her students about the war, about the home front, about the women who had worked in factories and shipyards. Most of them listened politely, but without real comprehension. The war was ancient history to them, as remote as the Civil War had been to her when she was young. Helen made a career with the Army Nurse Corps, serving in Korea and later in Vietnam, before finally retiring in the 1970s. She had seen more death and suffering than anyone should have to witness, but she had also saved countless lives, and that gave her work meaning. She kept in touch with Dorothy through letters and occasional visits, and their friendship remained strong despite the distance and the different paths their lives had taken. Kate became something of a legend in aviation circles, one of the first women to break barriers in civilian test flying. She fought constant battles for recognition and fair treatment, but she never gave up, never let the discrimination drive her away from work she loved. When the military finally allowed women to serve as combat pilots decades later, Kate was there to celebrate, to see the doors she had pushed against finally swing open.